Okay, so second block. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about a film. And again, some of this may not apply to the really small budgets, but I'll try to tailor it a little bit so it's a little bit more equity driven maybe. Okay, so we've seen this many times. Obviously, let's mention something about production. So the good news is, in some cases, they have different deals and feasible deals based on the budget level. So know, for example, with the guilds, when you qualify, if you're dealing with actors that are guild members, writers that are WGA, know know where the changes are for you as a producer when you no longer qualify for the low budget deal that the guilds offer you, because they're different. They're different than, you know, a bigger movie. So it's something to keep in mind for sure when you go at it, because if you imagine you going down and you're confident in what you're doing as a movie and you're $1,000 over the cutoff point for low budget, suddenly your planning is going to have to be different and probably going to be more expensive if you're above that, because the reason those deals exist is they're trying to still make it possible and attractive for people to do things at a lower budget level. So, and by the way, the same thing on these production incentives. We talked earlier about how, you know, you can be fooled by what looks at the first conversation like a huge percentage, and then when you actually go through your process, it turns out it's not going to be that percentage, very likely, because things are going to happen when you go through your specific movie that aren't going to qualify. So it could be at a low budget level, you're much better off just finding a place where you can shoot it for less. You know, you'd rather get the savings below the line somewhere and not have to go through the cost and the time to get the soft money deal. It can happen. We were talking during the break, you know, internationally, they now have a deal from the government, but I have, you know, friends in Serbia, for example, and places that have, I think, you know, probably the Czech Republic is a little bit like this still. I mean, they have these, and it's not like they don't have some rich histories in making movies, but they have certain kinds of costs below the line, heavy set building, you know, costuming. Mm-hmm. So there's certain kinds of movies that you can end up better off not doing the soft money deal, but just finding a good below the line savings place where people will make smart deals. Also, at low budget level, don't forget about trying to make a deal with post-production house. You know, you might be surprised. If they like what you're doing, you can demonstrate you're gonna get it to the right place. You know, they'll sometimes bargain and contribute part of their services, and that's found money for you as a producer. Right?
Why would they do that?
They're going to take an interest in the movie with you.
Okay.
But they're risking, you know, but they're willing. It's a risk for them to do that, as opposed to say, well, this is my fee. I want it all paid out of the budget. So they're either going to try to get their profit margin that way, or if they really like what you're doing, there are some in LA that work in the independent space all the time that will speculate a little bit with you. That's a big help, especially at a small budget. Now, if you end up in a conversation where you have to get a completion bond, the bond company is going to look at something like that pretty closely, because they're assuming the risk of that post house and the value they're putting in. So like if the post house is going to argue with you, for example, in that kind of a negotiation, that what they're bringing has a certain value in your budget, you're going to be probably pushing back a little bit and saying, oh, come on, you know, what's your real cost of doing this, right? Yeah. So that's a negotiation. The bond company is taking on the risk that if they have to replace your post house or do it differently, that they can find that value for the work at a predictable price for them. And so they might not give you the same kind of, they might not view it as the same kind of value. So if you have a bond conversation. But anyways, so let's, yeah, and by the way, while we're at it, I guess, you know, I'll talk about the collection agent again. They do kind of, they're like a turnstile business. They often take, 1% of the money that comes through the collection account. There's a value to that, especially with investors, because there's a comfort that a third, if I'm an investor and you come to me with a movie, and I like the movie, but we don't know each other before this movie, we don't know how it's going to go, we think it's going to go well, but what if it doesn't? And people don't trust the behavior of other people all the time, and as producers, you have to think sometimes the same way. So an investor might say, well, look, what happens if you go and you sell the movie and you take the money in? What happens if you don't pay me back? I get to sue you. Nobody likes that. Certainly you're not going at it with a goal of being sued, but you see people behave in very unusual ways based on the circumstances, and an investor might look at that and say, well, why do I want to take that risk? And one of the ways you start to take that risk away from them is you say, well, there's going to be a collection account that's monitored by a third party, so all the receipts from the movie are going to go into that. There's a contract that everybody signs up front, like an escrow agreement, and that third party is gonna be the one that distributes the cash. So investors like that, because now there's a control element that, to the extent the movie makes money, there's a third party that's not the producer, it's not the sales agent, it's not anybody else that might be able to divert the money. Okay, so we saw, and you'll see some repetitive slides here. We looked at this one before, talking about the whole production process and really sort of the whole project timeline and where different types of capital might get involved. So from that, we now we generally look at part of that timeline. So here's that same thing from the earlier slide, and we talk a little bit about production financing specifically. So we kind of have cut out the development side. What usually happens is whatever got funded in development is probably in the budget, and it's probably a cost item in the budget. Where at a low budget viewpoint, you might be working very hard here to convince the writer to hang in there, defer some of their fees. Deferments are a really important tool potentially for you with private equity. So, and banks require this sometimes too. It's entrepreneurial, so as a producer, a lot of people are going to try to squeeze you. It's what happens. And investors, they use a word that's called alignment of interest. So they're always looking for you to demonstrate to them, if they risk their money on you, how is your compensation tied to them getting their money back? Okay, so one of the ways that you sometimes do that is you say, okay, here's my fee in the budget. And a lot of times this is a negotiation that happens right up until the minute the film is shooting. It's a wild ride. Being a producer is not for the faint of heart. But you may find yourself in a situation where what you thought was a value didn't materialize in time, to make the whole plan work, or maybe you had two investors, one of them fell out. It happens. I've been in positions providing capital that recoups way ahead of all the investors, and you spend a lot of time, the producers obviously spend more time, you get the project all the way, you're ready to close, you're ready to fund, and one of those equity pieces, they're gone. They just, something happened, they either changed their mind, another opportunity came up, they no longer have the funds. Somebody asked a question earlier about, what's the ideal way to get the money in? I mentioned an escrow. If you get the money up front, because you're planning everything about spending a certain amount of money, you don't want to be in a position where you're going back and asking for that as you're shooting the movie.
Yeah.
You probably will get stuck somehow. Either because somebody changes their mind, or just something as simple as the timing of that money. Because once you're going, when you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, it's costing money. So it's costing more money, right? So one way to deal with investors is you ask them to escrow, and if you end up at a size of budget or a requirement that you have to use a completion bond, the bonding companies often for a fee, just like an escrow company, but they sometimes will serve as the escrow company. So that's maybe useful with an investor, because they say, look, they're also going to be doing the bond service that protects you. Put the money with them. You don't even have to give me the money. You just have to agree to put the money in and actually put it in. So the other thing you can do is deferments. So let's say you're going along and you're negotiating with equity, and they like it, but you're arguing over what kind of terms to give them, you know, how much they exactly are going to put in. These are very real conversations, and so maybe you have in your quiver, one of the arrows you pull out is that look, here's what our budgeted fees are. Believe me, they're gonna focus in on what you're making off the movie, because from their point of view, I give you money today. Tomorrow, part of that money is going to pay you. Okay? That's not an alignment of interest. To an investor, they view that as what they call leakage, or money that's not going on the screen in the movie. It is, and you know it is because it's your services that are making it happen. But from their point of view, you know, they don't know necessarily what that value point is. So one way you can approach that is you can say, because if you're the producer, you at least control the producer fees. This sounds very painful, and it is, but you can say, look, I will, just to convince you, let's say they're right there, just to convince you, I will defer a portion of my fee. You've spent all this time, you probably don't want to do this for free. Certainly if you don't have to, you won't. So, but you may be able to, you know, it won't be fun, but maybe you can, you know, defer a portion of what otherwise would be your fee in the budget. Or maybe you can convince the writer to defer a portion of their fee. You know, you agree then, you might have to amend the writer's contract where, you know, one of the first expenses you're going to have is to make sure that the chain of title is clean. And I don't know if anybody knows about what a chain of title is, but it's an important concept, and it's important for every kind of capital. From the underlying rights, let's say it was an original screenplay, oftentimes that screenplay gets registered. What capital does not want to have happen is they commit to do your movie, and during the movie, after the movie's made, somebody makes a claim that you didn't have the rights to that movie. So a chain of title is effectively sort of a legal trail of documents and contracts that says these rights for this idea to become this movie, connect the dots. Here's all the pieces, and they end up in that SPE that has control of them. And if you have a problem with your chain of title, you're certainly gonna have trouble with any sophisticated investor that knows to look at that, or frankly, a lot of investors that aren't very sophisticated just know how to find an attorney who knows this stuff. And if they see a problem with that, you're likely to have a big problem that could mean they're not gonna do anything. So, but back to deferments. A deferment at least is a way, because it demonstrates to the investor that I'm risking a part of what I otherwise would get paid out of this budget to be along with you in the risk. The other things investors are often going to ask for is what's called a preferred recoupment of their money. Okay, so you know, I give you $300,000 to make a movie. We've gotten past all the parts of you demonstrating why it's a good opportunity. We negotiated what the budget should be, what it should look like, all the terms of that. Here's the money. But as soon as you start generating receipts, and that may include if you use soft monies, I want those receipts as well. The first monies that are getting paid back is that risk money that made the move. Usually investors want that money back with some sort of a premium for having taken the risk. So that premium, a lot of times, really simplistically, especially at smaller budgets, is just a percentage of their capital that they risk. So for equity investors, a lot of times, and this happens at bigger budgets too, but certainly at smaller budgets, don't be surprised if an investor says, from all the receipts that you generate with this movie, I want to get 120% of my risk capital back. So that says, okay, I gave you, let's use a simpler example, I gave you $100,000. I want to get, before anybody else is getting receipts, because you got a little bit of budgeted money out of the, or budgeted receipts for yourself out of the budget as a producer fee. I want to get my money back with some return for having taken the risk. That's not unusual. And then a lot of times, we talked earlier about the sort of upside or the back end being split 50-50 between the capital and sort of the producer team. So let's say you spend $100,000, you manage to get $200,000 in after paying distribution fees. There's a lot of people that are taking money along the way, and not for nothing. They're actually generally doing something to get that, and they're hoping to generate the receipts. So you end up, net of all that activity, with $200,000 that they receive. By the way, that's already a success. So from that $200,000, the investor takes their $120,000 back. There's still $80,000 left. In a simple scenario, that $80,000 gets split $40,000 to the investor, so they win. They get a nice hand. They've now gotten 60%, 160% of their original capital back. And the other $40,000 goes to your team, and then you have already made agreements as to what the share of that is. As a producer, you're clearly going to participate in that. They're most likely the writer is going to participate in that. Maybe the director is going to participate in that. But you're going to control that, and you'll know that on the front end. But they call it sort of a recoupment or receipts waterfall. And it's just really sort of the negotiation of who gets what out of first the receipts and then the profits. And there's a lot of different ways. I mean, if you want to talk about something that's negotiable outside of that standard model, you know, it's a whole seminar just on that lawyers teach, just on negotiating the back end. But as a producer, there are useful things to know about that. Maybe you deferred money, and maybe either after the investor got their original $100,000 back, or after they got their $120,000, the next monies that come out before anything gets split recovers that deferment that you gave up. Okay, so you may have a corridor to recoup, and maybe it's before they get their 120% back. Maybe it's you covered all their risk capital, and maybe you split earlier until you recoup that deferment. You know, so it's a wide open field as to how you go about that. Okay, so we've seen this numerous times, so I'm just going to go past this. You guys might want to just read this. You don't have to read this, by the way. There are other ways to get this information. Oh, somebody asked a question earlier that you said I should repeat about soft monies. I believe it's a free website you can go to called The Incentives Office. All together, I think no breaks in any of the words, but it's THE Incentives with an S Office. I think it's .com, and friends of mine, you know, do that. They actually get paid as advisors, usually on bigger projects, to help them evaluate, maximize the soft monies, help with calculations, or know how to get people, accountants and or other advisors who can do that for them. And they have a very good current knowledge of certainly all the soft money deals in the US. So if you're thinking about one state versus another state, and on their website, I think you can actually go down and see what should be a pretty reliable current status of each of the states that offer it. The last count I had, there were roughly 40 of the US states that had some form of an incentive deal. So it's a overload of information, to be quite honest, but you probably would never, unless you're just curious, you probably would never need to know 40 states, you'd probably end up with 2 or 3 as a practical matter that you might really consider, and because those probably fit your movie. And I would always advise, find something where the movie makes sense first, then go from there. Okay, so all I did here was just give you sort of a little working explanation of pre-sales. We've talked about those a little bit already. Soft monies, we've obviously talked about those. Sales estimates, talked a little bit less about them, but remember that when the sales agent projects the sort of global value, it's whatever they haven't pre-sold. Or even said another way, when they have pre-sold, that's what they expect from the territory generally. You have chances to get into upsides, but once a pre-sale happens, as a producer, I would just count on at best getting the minimum guarantee. So that's fair?
Yeah.
Okay. Straight distribution. So this is where there's no minimum guarantee. This happens internationally. It happens in the U.S. a lot, especially for independent movies. So obviously, it's a bigger risk for the producer and for the capital that funded the movie, because there's no downside, protection on the risk. If the movie flops, you get a percentage of a flop, as opposed to somebody who put up a minimum guarantee, and at least you're going to get that amount of money when you deliver the movie. So all of this strategy of pre-sales, soft monies, and getting capital based on that, you're protecting the capital, but you're also protecting yourself as not being looked at as having lost all the investors' money. So they really are risk protection mechanisms. And the reason they exist is that that's how capital gets attracted to the business, is they figure out, is there a smarter way than just, I like one movie, and this happens, angel investor, I like one movie, I like one filmmaker, here you go. But a lot of the capital, they're thinking about all this in a very different way. They're thinking, I'm going to do 10 of these a year. They may not all work out the way I expect, but the way they calculate things is not necessarily, I have to make this movie. If you're lucky, you have capital that is that passionate about it, but more likely it's capital that says, how do I diversify my risk over several of these things so that when and if one of them doesn't recover its money, I have a chance to make my overall money back by something else doing well. You have that incredibly on the distribution side. Think about it. I'm a buyer for Latin America. I'm a buyer for Latin America. Yes. I pretend to be a buyer for Latin America. And I'm going to put up a minimum guarantee on a movie that, oh, by the way, I'm not going to get delivery of for a year. Happens a lot.
All the time.
All the time. And so what's his reason for wanting to do that? Maybe he's got a competitor that he realizes, and everyone's having their conversations about who's doing what. He realizes that if he doesn't do that, one of his big competitors is going to take that movie. That's a factor in why to risk the money. But he's taken a big risk. I mean, if he can't lay off those rights, or the worse, I mean, probably the more frequent thing is the movie just isn't executed well. And it may be well produced and just mishandled by the director, a cast that you were counting, an actor you were counting on, just not their show. It's like something goes wrong. It happens all the time when something looks great on paper, and you look at all the track records, you look at everything. It's a risky business. It is, and so in that case, an international buyer they're underwater. They risk their money and they don't get their money back. And guess what? If you're the producer of that, they remember that. and they, because that's part of your track record now. That's part of your bio. And if a lot of international distributors lost a lot of money, they're going to look, to who was a sales agent that sold me that, probably first. And secondly, who produces, and if you are responsible for a series of those, where the majority of them ended up like that, somebody's, either they just come to a conclusion that they made a huge repetitive number of mistakes, or somebody misled them they think. And probably rightfully so. They think, well, or you know, or they just sort of say, you know, the way the information was presented was here, and what got delivered was here. And they will start, what they'll really do is just stop paying money up front. They'll say, well, show it to me when it's done. If I like it, I like it.